Our second scripture reading comes from the Gospel according to John. I've shortened it just a little bit from what is listed in your bulletin because there's a lot to take in. But listen now for the word of God. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for Jesus himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And then Jesus took the loaves and he gave thanks, and he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the sign that Jesus had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." This is the word of the Lord. If you feel as if you are hearing a sermon on Jesus feeding the crowds every time you come to church, it's because you are. There is a version of this story in each of the 4 gospel accounts, and 2 of the gospel writers thought it was so important that they included it twice. So this is Christianity 101. Jesus cares about the needs of the people. Got it? This one, John's version, is interesting though because it is so rich with details. It's not just that Jesus is attentive to the needs of the people. John, of course, wants us to know that, but he's very specific. He gives us the name of the place, both names of the place. He gives us the season. It's the Passover, so we know to be thinking about the Exodus when we hear this story. It's not just loaves of bread, but it's a particular kind of loaf, barley loaves, a poor person's food. It's not just some fish, but it is specifically 2 fish. So many details. It's like John is saying, pay attention. This is important. And it's the details of any story that make it so rich, right? It could have happened anywhere, but it happened here, in a particular place with particular people, with personalities and quirks of their own. It's general, it's a story for all of us, but it's also quite specific. In fact, one of the specific details of John's version that I find really interesting is what I think we can think of as a classic example of a church committee meeting. There is an extreme need in the community. Here, it is that tons of people are here and they're hungry. They need to be fed. But it could be anything. The problem of homelessness, or the boiler that has gone out unexpectedly and needs to be replaced. There's a big need, and it appears that the resources on hand are not sufficient to fix the problem. Well, Philip, who is on the finance committee, quickly does the math. It definitely won't work. There's nowhere near enough cash on hand to buy the bread that is needed. Andrew, though, works in community ministries, and so he works the crowd. He does an inventory of what's available. He comes back disappointed too, though, because it seems there's just one boy with a few loaves and a couple of fish. Clearly, not enough. Every church needs some Philips. They help us to be good stewards of our resources and to honor the commitments we make. We cannot survive without them. And every church needs some Andrews. They're the ones who know how to connect with the people, to help them use their strengths in service. They're problem solvers and can-do kinds of people. And often, this kind of a team can work together to find a way to get the job done. In fact, in the other versions of this story, Jesus hands the dilemma back to the disciples. What are you going to do about this? He asks. And that is a great sermon to preach. What are we going to do about the enormous needs in the world? In the other versions, lounging in the grass and watching Jesus do his thing is clearly not what Jesus has in mind for his disciples. But here, Jesus does the heavy lifting. He takes the measly bits that are offered and he distributes them. Somehow, with Jesus in the equation, the math works. It's a miracle, a sign, John calls it. I want to stop for a minute, though, and encourage you not to work too hard to explain this miracle. Lots of people have tried. And one of the best and most popular explanations for these feeding stories is the idea that the people really did have food with them. It was tucked away in baskets and pockets. And when they saw other people begin to share, they felt led to do the same. And in that way, there was enough to go around. That's an appealing idea to me. It keeps us on the hook to give what we can, and it makes it clear that we are responsible for caring for one another. So maybe that's what happened that day. And if it happened that way, we could say that that is a miracle in and of itself. We've certainly seen miracles take place in a similar way. A couple of years ago, there was a Tony Award-winning musical called Come From Away. Maybe you remember the story that the musical tells. On September 11th, 2001, as the terrible events of that day were unfolding, 38 international flights were directed to land at the airport in tiny Gander, Newfoundland, population 10,000. Those 38 planes contained approximately 700 frightened and disoriented passengers and crew, displaced people who needed food, shelter, medication, comfort. And the town sprang into action, undertaking the enormous and difficult task of feeding this 7,000, feeding these stranded travelers. They put up makeshift shelters, they gathered supplies, and some people even welcomed total strangers into their modest homes. The play does a marvelous job of developing the characters, of filling in the details. Many of the characters are based on actual people or composites of them. And it holds the same tension, I hope we can hold when we encounter these miracle stories. The people did their part, but God is at work in the mix. In a powerful section at the center of the musical, as the scope of what has happened in the U.S. is starting to set in, one passenger, a woman named Hannah, whose son is a New York City firefighter, is overcome by worry and grief. And a resident of the town takes her to the local Catholic church, where they light candles and they kneel to pray. Another character, a gay man whose personal life is falling apart, walks to the center of the stage and says, "I haven't been to church in years, but a song I learned when I was a kid has been playing in my head." He begins to sing the words to the beautiful prayer of St. Francis, a piece our own choir sings sometimes. "Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Lord, where there is doubt, faith." And as he sings, towards the back of the stage, a stranger approaches a rabbi who is stranded there on a flight from Israel. And this man tells the rabbi that he too is a Jew. His parents sent him as a child from Europe at the beginning of World War II. They made him promise for his own safety that he would never tell anyone of his Jewish identity. But now, he says, with so many stories lost on this day, he needs to tell someone his own story, the truth of who he is. And together, this resident of Gander and the rabbi begin to sing a children's song in Hebrew that he remembers from his childhood. And that song weaves into the St. Francis prayer. And then, a Muslim man who had been embarrassingly strip searched at the airport is getting ready to begin his evening prayers. And a woman from the town tells him that she has cleared a space in the school library that he might have a place to pray. And as he begins his prayer, the songs of the three great Abrahamic faiths mingle together. The first man steps forward and he sings, "Where there is despair, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, ever joy." On the one hand, we can explain exactly what happened in Gander in those days after 9/11. People pitched in, they banded together, they did their part. But that's not all, is it? There's some mystery and holiness there to the eyes of faith. We have to suspect that came from somewhere else. You see, sometimes when God gets involved, things happen that we can't fully explain. It's comforting and even exciting to think that we can figure out some of these mysteries and that we can all do our part. But the truth is, our knowledge of the love of God begins where our ability to explain ends. John gives us so many details about the where, when, why, and who, but he doesn't tell us about the how. John is the mystic, the one who calls Jesus the Word, the bread of heaven, the way, the truth, and the life. But with John, the story is never just the story. There's always another layer. So this is also a story about a crowd that is hungry for something only Jesus can offer, the bread of heaven, the promise of hope, the presence of a God who is with us in our daily living and who cares for our bodies and our spirits. You have surely heard it said that the devil is in the details. And this phrase is often applied when you take something that's a good idea, and then when you get down into the nitty-gritty of it, it's more complicated than previously expected. Comes up in discussions about logistics, budgets, committee meetings. Sometimes, this feeling that the complexity is too much or that the numbers just won't work, sometimes that's the end of an idea or the death of a dream. But sometimes, God intervenes. And what doesn't seem like enough is actually plenty. Sometimes 5 loaves plus 2 fishes divided by 5,000 equals enough plus 12 leftover baskets. I don't know how Jesus does this, but I know that he does sometimes. Sometimes love makes a way, and we can't explain it, but we can receive it and offer our thanks.